study the book of Revelation, pray for learn more about it. Just pray for you bless us all that are here tonight. Keep those that could be here and all that would. Thank you for Jesus. So much good we pray.
All right. So, Revelation chapters 15 and 16 are collectively lesson 7 in our lesson plan. They're the 7 bowls of plagues. We read both chapters last week and talked a bit about the symbolism of chapter 15 and the first 4 bowls. So, one thing we noted is the entire book of Revelation, the vision after the initial vision of Jesus standing among the lampstands, it all takes place in the throne room of God. And from the throne room, they can see all these other events happening around the earth. The gist of how John describes it is almost like space does not matter in the throne room of God, which makes a lot of sense. So no matter how far away something is, it appears you can view it as if you're right there next to it. And so rather than only being able to see one thing at a time, it's as if the vision is directing John's focus where he needs to be focused, since he can see everything all at once.
Is this just Earth, or is this the universe? Because God created heavens and earth.
Here.
So is everything... Like that, or is it just Earth? Because we don't know there are other planets with other creatures on it, humanoid creatures or anything else. So are we talking Earth or universe?
Okay.
Good one, huh?
We're gonna get bogged down into the weeds here for just a moment.
Nice.
Okay, so Revelation specifically talks about. Okay. So I think the futurists are completely wrong. I think very little of Revelation has anything to do with the last few days, or the last few years. I think almost all of Revelation is as an idealist, I believe Revelation is about whenever a human nation rises up against God, the judgment that then follows. But I'm very sympathetic to the preterists and the historists because I can see where they get their bits. And as I mentioned from time to time, a lot of the historist stuff is very elegant. There's actually a really interesting bit of argumentation for the historist in this particular bit of text. But even if the preterists are right, then, so whether it's the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of Rome, then the idealists are kind of right too, because you can take the principles from Rome or from Jerusalem and apply them to every nation that rejects God. Because that's why Rome and Israel were judged. It's because they rejected God. The historists, if the historists are right, then the idealists are also kind of right, because the historists take us through every time. All of these judgments are different judgments on different nations that reject God throughout history. So it's sort of the same thing, regardless of which of the 3 views you take. it sort of all boils down to, and the reason it's relevant to us is because sometimes nations still today reject God, and he's going to judge them, and things are going to happen. Whereas with the futurist, what they view it as is God becoming a liar, because Jesus said, "Of that day and hour no man knows." But if we have the entire 1,000 years before his return laid out for us in Revelation, then Jesus lied, and as soon as those 1,000 years start, it's going to be pretty obvious what comes after, if that makes sense. Especially if it starts with a rapture and a bunch of Christians all of a sudden just disappear. Be pretty obvious what started. So I think the futurists are wrong for a multitude of reasons. When it comes to alien life in Christianity, the presence of life outside of this planet does not repudiate, it doesn't negate Christianity. So whether or not God created life on other planets doesn't really affect Christianity. Not least of which is because more likely than not we'll never meet them. And even if we do, the Great Commission is worded in such a way as any intelligent life is subject to the Great Commission. So
covered.
Yeah.
Any other planet that has any type of living beings like us
Are
is going to have the exact same thing.
Probably.
And their revelations would be for their planet.
Yeah. And at the end of
And
the
there's no escape for us because there's no way we're going to achieve space travel to get to anywhere else like Star Trek or
well, I don't reject the possibility of space travel, but if God created intelligent life elsewhere, I suspect it's not in this galaxy. And it would just make a lot more sense for us to just colonize this galaxy rather than.
But there could be like a black hole,
Hmm?
and there could be a black hole, and through that,
Ooh, so that gets into wormhole theory.
We'll just stick with this planet.
Yeah. There,
Revelations is for this planet.
there
Our
are,
revelations.
yeah, all I'll say in the black hole is that technically the math works out for black holes to be entrances to other universes, but they can also just be black holes, so it doesn't really matter.
You're just dead.
Either way, once you enter, there's no returning. If they are an entrance to another universe, they're a one-way entrance. So if you went through them, it'd be like you left. It'd be like you're dead here. Okay. All right. So in this vision, we turn our attention back to the throne room for a little bit, and the sea of glass, which is the floor of the throne room, but also a symbol of purity, is now mingled with fire, which is a symbol of judgment. So God's purity is now mixed with judgment, or his judgment is now mixed with purity. Either way, the judgment is going to be purifying. in my notes I have, the purity of God has mingled with his fierce anger, thus producing righteous fury, especially towards those who improperly worshipped the beast from the earth and the dragon it serves. The worship of God is contrasted with the improper worship of the beast. Right, we have all of this improper worshiping of the beast in chapter 13. We have the conquest of the beast in chapter 14. Now in 15, we are in the throne room of God, and all of the saints and the and martyrs are now singing the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb. This is the song which Moses and the Lamb sings, the two who presented the laws and formed the covenants. Their song is a song of triumph and exaltation of the God who created the earth and rules the nations. In fact, at least part of the song of Moses and the song of the Lamb is listed as great and amazing are your deeds, O Lord God the Almighty. Just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship you, and your righteous acts have been revealed. I note that giving credence to the idea of these three segments, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls all being the same image repeated 3 times, is that the beast and its worshippers have already been defeated in chapter 14. But now we're going back and we're punishing them again. But if they're already defeated, then why are we still punishing the nation that's been defeated? So it's best to view chapter 14 as chapter 14 is best viewed as the final bit of conquest, and then we're sort of returning and talking about the stuff leading up to that final conquest, if that makes sense. This borrows very heavily from Hebrew writing. If you remember back in Genesis, there were a lot of times when Moses would write something and then he'd sort of stop and we'd back up and we'd explore something we had just talked about a little bit in greater detail. The most famous example of this is in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where in Genesis 1 he says, God created them male and female, in his image he created them in chapter 1, and then he goes back and he tells us exactly how he did that in chapter 2. And so we end with God resting, but we go back in chapter 2 and we talk about day 6 in greater detail. And so it's not completely chronological, which bothers a lot of Americans and English speakers in general, and most Europeans, because that's not how we write stories anymore. That's not how we write narratives. That's not really how we discuss things. Like occasionally in a history book we'll do stuff like that, but it'll be generally noted. It'll be like, and now we're going back and we're talking about something in greater detail, and here's the year it happened so that you can keep it in order. But the Hebrew writers didn't really do that. They jumped all over the place chronologically, because to them, theme was more important than chronology. Like Genesis is generally chronological, but thematic elements are more lined up with each other rather than chronological events, if that makes sense. Which is why Judah and Tamar's story is told before Joseph's story, even though most of Joseph's story happens chronologically before Judah and Tamar. But the Judah and Tamar story is told first because it continues Israel's line. So we're talking about Jacob, right? We're talking about Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and then his heir is Judah. So before we go and start the narrative into Exodus with with Joseph, it makes sense to continue telling about how Judah's descendants got into the world. And so we tell the Judah and Tamar story. So, anyway, something similar seems to have happened here. Chapter 14 probably is better understood as taking place about the time the sixth angel pours the bowl into the great river Euphrates. Why? Because chapter 14 talks about a great battle, and chapter 16 gives a name to the great battle, or to the place of the great battle as Armageddon. The first four bowls, we're still doing recap. It's about half, class is about half over, we're still doing recap. The first four bowls are reminiscent of the first four trumpets, which were reminiscent of the first four seals. In that they are definitely sort of their own thing, and then 5, 6, and 7 are a different group. The first angel pours out his bowl on the earth, and harmful and painful sores come upon the people who bore the mark of the beast, worship its image. The second, we noted that this is a reference to the well, there's a few things it references. The first thing it references, as the preterist note, is it is a reference to the curse that God lays on the Israelites, which is if they reject God, then he will send the painful boils and no healing will come that he sent on the Egyptians. Which leads to my point, which is the painful boils on the Egyptians. If I remember right, it's the first time two things happen. One, it's the first time God did not send it on the Israelites as well. The Israelites were affected by the Nile turning to blood. The Israelites had frogs in their houses and on their streets. The Israelites had a bunch of gnats everywhere too. But the boils did not affect the Israelites. And I believe that one was the first time that happened. But it's also the first time that God sort of touched the Egyptians themselves. Oh, and the flies. Plague 4 was the flies. But it's the first time God touched the Egyptians themselves. And yeah, all the other four plagues were serious, but this is when things started to get actually catastrophic. Right, the Nile all turned to blood, and all the fish died, and everything stank. Frogs came up everywhere and then died, and everything stank. But at least you have it doesn't destroy the Nile's fertility. And it doesn't destroy the economy to have a bunch of stinking frogs everywhere. Flies and gnats, same thing. It's really annoying. It affects things a little bit, even in the long run, but it's not catastrophic. But from the point of the boils onward, everything becomes increasingly more catastrophic. All your livestock are dead. The locusts eat everything. Anything that the locusts don't eat, God destroys with hail. Your economy is completely ruined. There are dead people. There's definitely dead animals. And finally, all the firstborn of Egypt die. Right? It's increasingly catastrophic. I guess you could argue that 9 is kind of a return to the first 4, where technically it's not going to be that catastrophic in the long run to have 3 days of darkness. It is a bit catastrophic to your religion, but you know, it's definitely an omen of things to come, of what's about to come. In the same way, this bowl is a mark of no return. Everything after this is much worse than everything before it. The second angel poured his bowl out into the sea, and it became like the blood of a corpse. Now, I didn't note this last time, but the blood of a corpse is not the free-flowing blood that we saw in the Nile River in the first plague. It was reminiscent of the first plague of Egypt, but the blood of a corpse is not free-flowing. It's congealed, because blood congeals after a bit, especially if it sits just sort of still in a corpse that's not moving. It same reason that you can get blood clots from just sitting around all day. But it's your entire body. It's been sitting out for a while, and now the entire ocean is like that, and it's just thick blood. So if this is literal, like the futurist think, not to mention that the planet's apparently already been cracked in half from an asteroid the size of a mountain smashing into the earth. But also, now at the second bowl, all of the oceans turn into the blood of a corpse, so it's thick, and every living thing died that was in the sea. It's not just like the fish that are dead, but the dolphins are dead because they can't move in the thick blood, and your boats are stuck. So all the sailors die because they're stranded out in the middle of nowhere without the ability to move their boats anymore. But it's not so thick that you can walk on it, right? And the third angel, but this, just like the second and third, and then the rivers turned to blood in the third bowl. But just like the second and third trumpet, this appears to be more about things that you take for granted going away. In the trumpets, they go away by a third. Here now they're completely gone, which makes sense, because if your nation is being judged, and your culture is being judged, and God is destroying all of your culture, then all those little things that you took for granted. We brought up Roman roads last time, but if we want to go more modern, it's the infrastructure that we drive our cars on. It's how long would it take the earth to reclaim asphalt if no one laid it? Not too long, right? Maybe 40 years. This stuff doesn't really keep up very well. It's got to be replaced all the time. But all the stuff that you take for granted, that comes about because of your culture, it's all going to go away, and it's going to be as if it never really existed. Because we brought up how many Roman roads are there left in the world, and it's not that many. It's like 2 or 3. Might be a few more. I think there's one around the Areopagus at the moment. Yeah, but it's definitely not enough. It's the statement "all roads lead to Rome" is no longer true. Well, at least not when we're talking about Roman roads. There's not enough of them. The British Empire, some of the things that they took for granted was they had a British citizen living in Britain during the height of the empire could basically get anything they wanted from anywhere in the world for really cheap. Like it was all there in London, and they took that for granted. Granted, that's kind of true today, but it's because of us, not because of them. And wow. The fourth angel pours his bowl out on the sun. It's allowed to scorch people with fire. Often the sun represents, in images like this, the sun represents the law and order. And so this is the law of the nation burning its own citizenry. That towards the end of a nation's judgment, its own laws are designed in such a way as to hurt their own citizenry, which is true out of just about every major empire that's ever collapsed, especially in on themselves. Even the British kind of avoided this, but their laws were not designed to hurt the citizenry of Britain, but they were definitely designed to hurt the citizenry of the colonies, and sort of abuse their power over them, which is actually ultimately what led to their collapse, because then we left, and the Australians left, sort of, and the Canadians left, sort of, and then the Indians left, definitely. But it was the creation of two different levels of citizenry that ultimately led to the downfall of the British Empire. And similarly with the Romans, they also had similar setups where they weren't taking care of the people that they were ruling over as well as they should, which led to a lot of unrest and destruction from the inside. All right, so we've done a little bit of review. Any questions or comments up to this point? Okay. We get someone to read verses 10 through 11. We'll cover the fifth bowl here.
Which chapter?
16.
And the fifth angel poured out his vial onto the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain. Then blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds.
Okay, so the fifth angel pours his bowl out on the throne of the beast, and its kingdom is plunged into darkness. And people gnawed their tongues in anguish and cursed the God of heaven for their pain and sores, and they did not repent of their deeds. So the fifth bowl plunges the nation into darkness. What do you think it symbolizes? Hmm?
I didn't hear the question.
I said, what do you think it symbolizes that the nation is all of a sudden plunged into darkness?
Total chaos.
Okay.
Loss.
Chaos, loss. Yeah, it's a loss of direction, right? They up to this point, yeah, things are going badly, but they're a nation. They're a coherent nation. After the fifth plague, they're no longer a coherent nation. They're going every which way, and they've lost their direction, which sets them up to be especially on poor footing in the next few verses. All right, so verses 12 through 16. Someone else can read that?
The sixth angel poured out a bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. And I saw three evil spirits that looked like frogs that came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of false prophets. They are spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for battle on the great day of the Almighty. Behold, they come like a thief. Blessed is he who stays away, he keeps his clothes with him, so that he may not go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon.
All right. So this is a fun little bit. So the sixth angel pours its bowl on the Euphrates, causing it to dry up. And if you'll remember, what is the symbolic nation that is representing whatever nation we're judging? Babylon. Babylon sits on the Euphrates. So just like the sixth trumpet talks about angels coming out of the area of the Euphrates and going out into the world, here we're talking about the Euphrates drying up, which seems to symbolize a destruction from within. Which, if your laws are designed to sort of oppress your people, and your nation is no longer a coherent people and are leaderless and directionless, destruction is going to come from within. It's pretty natural. It's a pretty normal thing to expect. But in a last-ditch effort, the beast, the dragon, and the false prophet, their unclean spirits come out of them like frogs and go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for a battle on the great day of the God, the Almighty. Behold, I'm coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garment on, that he may not be naked and be seen exposed. And so that's a reference to Jesus saying, I'm coming like a thief in the night, which seems to indicate that it's talking about the last day of judgment, but this is also language Jesus used about the destruction of Jerusalem. So that does leave a little bit of credence to this being about the destruction of Jerusalem, and that Jesus uses the exact same phrase about the destruction of Jerusalem. But he was also sort of more broadly talking about any time God comes in judgment, it's kind of unexpected. God comes in judgment on nations sort of out of the blue. Not really out of the blue, but kind of out of the blue. He doesn't announce he's about to come in judgment. He doesn't send a 10-day warning. And so it's pretty easy to fit this into any of the interpretations. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. So this is a fancy bit of linguistical work. What does Armageddon mean? Does anyone know? What?
It's a cool Vietnam movie.
Well, so it's taken on a connotation of destruction and finality, but that's not actually what the word means. It means the mountain of Megiddo. I guess the prefix "r" and the suffix "don" or "on" together turns things into the names of mountains in Hebrew. And so we apply these to the word Megiddo, and it sort of changes form a little bit. It becomes Armageddon. And that's a transliteration from Hebrew. So John just randomly puts a Hebrew word here in his Greek manuscript. But the point is this: Megiddo is a real place. You know what it isn't? It's not a mountain. In fact, it's the opposite of a mountain. It's a valley. So John is using the image of Megiddo, but by telling us it's Mountain Megiddo or Mount Megiddo, he's telling us it's not a real place that he's talking about. Megiddo is a real valley, and historically, Megiddo is the valley where nations meet in order to wage war on each other within the nation of Israel. So the Israelites sit in the middle of this place called the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent starts on the tip of the Persian Gulf, goes all the way up the Euphrates, and then dips down towards Canaan. And it sort of ends at the wilderness of Sinai, or the wilderness of Sin. And that's the Fertile Crescent. And so between the two pieces of the Fertile Crescent, there's just desert. There's always been desert, ever since people have inhabited this place. So if you're marching an army from Babylon to Egypt, where do you go?
Fertile Crest.
You go all the way up. Yeah, it's longer, but otherwise you've got the nightmare logistics of taking an entire army across the desert. I think some people have tried that. The only ones who've ever successfully done it are the Huns. Or not the Huns. It's Genghis Khan and the. Who did Genghis Khan rule? Anyway, Genghis Khan was the only person to ever successfully do that. He's the only great general who's ever successfully marched an entire army across a desert. And the only way they were able to do that is all of his horsemen were already accomplished hunters. That's all they were. Is that they were just a giant band of hunters. So every man was in charge of hunting his own food. Otherwise, it's nightmare logistics because you got to supply all these guys with food and water, and you got to supply the people who are supplying them with food and water. It's a whole thing. Excuse me. So.
It says here, Armageddon is referred to as a symbolic battlefield where the last battle between good and evil will be fought.
That is the view of the futurists. Yeah. Because like I said, Megiddo is a real place, but it's a valley. And so if the Babylonians are coming to fight the Egyptians, and the Egyptians decide to go out to meet them, you know about where they're going to meet? Israel or Canaan. And so historically, the Canaanites and also the Israelites would simply let them meet, but they would tell them to go meet in Megiddo. Go have your battle here, so that it doesn't affect us. Because you're not warring with us, you're warring with each other. And there's this great big valley that's a great place for you to go have your battle. And
If it's the last battle between good and evil, would that be fought on all ground?
well, see, Armageddon,
It's supposed to be the last battle fought by mankind.
no, that's what the futurists say that it is. What it is here is it's the last battle between this wicked nation, the Great Babylon, and God. But anytime you're going to war against God, you're going to lose. So it doesn't matter how many reinforcements they bring. It doesn't matter how many favors they call in from other nations that owe it to them. This Great Babylon, they've already lost. But they come out to this Mount Megiddo, which doesn't actually exist, and then they lose. And the account of them losing is in chapter 14.
You have people that refer to, when you hear people talk, they refer to Armageddon as
It's because, for some reason, the futurist interpretation, despite being the most insane interpretation of Revelation, has become the pop culture interpretation of Revelation. So a lot of people mistakenly believe that it's the only interpretation of Revelation, or that it's the one that makes the most sense. But it doesn't make any sense. Because when you start taking everything in Revelation literally, well, first of all, you're stuck with a mountain that's also a valley, which is what Mount Megiddo is. And that doesn't make any sense. You're stuck with meteorites the size of mountains smashing into the earth, and somehow that's not the last thing that everyone sees, and the entire ocean turns into congealed blood, like actually. But these are all just symbols that are referring to other things. They're sort of equally as devastating, whatever they're talking about, but they're the end of a nation, not the end of the world. If that makes sense.
so Armageddon is basically not possible.
Well, whenever Jesus comes back, there's not going to be a battle. Jesus will come back and every knee is going to bow. That's all there is. That's all that's going to happen. When Jesus comes back, demonic forces aren't going to gather into a great last stand, and all the wicked men aren't going to be charging at all the righteous men. When Jesus comes back, every knee is going to bow. And that's just going to be it. But when God comes to judge a nation, that nation puts up a little bit of a fight, because that nation does not respect the authority of God in the way that it should. And they're also not recognizing that it's God coming in judgment on them. But God's also not putting out a sign that says every time a nation collapses is me. I mean, he kind of does. He's kind of saying that here. But God doesn't appear to if God didn't show up in Napoleon's dreams and say, I'm judging you and removing your emperorship from you. And you're going to go into exile. It just happened, right? So, that's sort of the point, is when Jesus comes back and the world and the universe ends, that's it. There's no great battle. Jesus just comes back and everyone realizes the authority there, whether they want to or not. When Jesus comes and judges a nation, he's not doing it physically as much as he's doing it providentially. And so there's more of a fight because people don't recognize the authority as instantly.
So when he does finally come back, you don't think there's gonna be
No.
anybody
How are you?
that still won't believe?
Not really. There's people who say that they won't, but I think it will be irrefutable. And Jesus literally says that every knee is going to bow. And you're going to have a hard time fighting him if your knees are bowing.
It's not a good fight, is it?
No.
Well, unless you're fighting a little bitty person, then it might be good, but, yeah.
Yeah. No, there's not really going to be a last. In the sense that everyone says that there's a last battle, there's not really going to be a last battle. I think nations, as they get judged, put up sort of last-ditch efforts to stay in power, which is what's being described here. But it doesn't work. Once God has decided that your nation's time in the sun is done, it's never worked. It's always, they've always faded away. However long it might take. For Rome, the destruction took about 300 years. For Britain, roughly the same. I would say they've probably nearly reached the end of their destruction. Spain's probably reached theirs. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. The seventh bowl is a final judgment. It's finished and complete after the bowl is poured. We're basically out of time, so we're going to cover the seventh bowl real quick. And I guess we'll talk about divergent takes next week. But the seventh angel pours out his bowl into the air, and the loud voice comes out of the temple from the throne, saying, "It is done." There are flashes and of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake, such as there had never been since man was on the earth. And so great was the earthquake that the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of nations fell. And God remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of wine of the fury of his wrath. And that mirrors exactly what is said in verse 8 of chapter 14. Hence part of why I said that the chapter 14 seems to be the sixth bowl. But fallen is Babylon the Great, who has made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Verse 10, he will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur the presence of the holy angels, and in the presence of the Lamb. Well, that's sort of the same thing as here. Fury of his wrath, drained the cup of wine of the fury of his wrath, and every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. Another great reason not to take this literally. Islands can't literally get up and run away. And mountains can't flatten themselves to not be found anymore. And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on the people, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. And so the seventh bowl is this final judgment. It's finished. It's complete after the bowl is poured. Like the seal and the trumpets, things don't happen right away. Right? The bowl is poured into the air. A loud voice says it's done. And then there's flashes of lightnings, rumblings, peals of thunder, and finally the great earthquake. And so there's always this calm right before the storm with each of these seventh things. Right before things actually happen, things don't happen right away. It's almost like there's a little bit of time to get out from under the judgment. And all these things tear down the great Babylon and divides her spoils with nothing. We can probably do the divergent takes real quick. Okay, so rapid fire on this. The historists are going to be the longest, so we're going to start with them. The general historical take is that the seven seals are the destruction of Rome. So way back when, the destruction of Rome is covered in the seven seals, with maybe the first four seals being the destruction of Jerusalem, depending on which historist you ask. The seven bowls, or the seven trumpets, are papal history, and then the seven bowls are the destruction of the Catholic Church, often referred to by the historist as the papal beast. So they identify the beast of the earth with the papacy, and the false prophet often is often identified with the Pope himself. Generally, the first bull here is linked to the French Revolution, marked by historists as the beginning of the end for the Catholic Church. Apparently, and this is very much a credit to the historists, apparently a well-known historist by the name of Robert Fleming, who lived in about the 1600s, accurately predicted that something major would occur in France using the year for a day measure, and that he said that something major would occur in France a century after his death. On the year that he predicted something would happen, the French Revolution started. Which, like I said, that's a major credit to the historist that he got that exactly right. But often the second and third and fourth bowls are all linked to Napoleon. So the French Revolution happens in about 20 years after that. Napoleon takes over and starts wreaking havoc in Europe. And the second bowl is linked to his naval wars, and the third bowl is linked to the land wars of the Napoleonic era. The fourth bowl is Napoleon taking the title of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire as the fourth, because this is often marked as the point of time in which the Catholics lost, basically, in which the Catholics lost their stranglehold on the politics of continental Europe. Right? They'd already lost Britain, but technically up until this point, with the exception here and there, the Catholics were sort of really in charge of all the politics around everything. But once they lost France to atheism, because that's what the French Revolution was, Once they lost France to atheism, and then Napoleon sort of conquered the entire continent for a short time, the Catholics no longer ever had, and still haven't had, the strength in politics that they once did in continental Europe. Still to this day. Even in Italy. The fifth one is also tied to Napoleonic era, of which the French ransacked Rome, which I didn't even know happened. Studying this made me realize I don't actually know that much about the Napoleonic Wars. I know he conquered the entire continent, and then the British came in, defeated him, and exiled him. But I realized I didn't actually know too much of the going-ons of what they did. So that's something I probably need to study. But the Sixth Bull is often identified with the two world wars that followed shortly after this, within about 100 years of Napoleon's death. And the seventh is often viewed as yet to come, so they don't really tie it to anything. But I guess whatever the seventh bull is pretty much the end of history, according to the historists. Although most historists are amillennials, or not amillennials, sorry, most historists are post-millennials, which means they actually view whatever Bull 7 is, yes, it's going to be worse than everything that came before it, but at the end of it, basically only the righteous are going to be around, or it will be so heavily, the world will be so heavily righteous that it'll basically be 1,000 years of peace, at the end of which Christ will come back. But the 1,000 years is not understood to be literal, so they avoid the difficulty that the premillennials have, where the premillennials view it as a literal 1,000 years, and thus make God a liar when he says that you don't know what day and hour I will come. The post-millennials don't view it as necessarily a literal 1,000. It's just a long time. It may be 3,000 years for all they know. It's just a long period of time in which things are really good and everyone's righteous. Where the vast majority of people are righteous. And there's no major wars. So, then the preterists become further divided over whether these last 7 plagues are all about Israel or Rome. So initially there's two paths. Either you believe the entire book is about Rome's destruction, or you believe the entire book is about Israel's destruction, especially Jerusalem's destruction. But then there's a third group who thinks that the seals and trumpets are about Jerusalem and the bowls are about Rome. It's not a huge deal of difference between all of these. The third grouping has to credit this, that God does not forget sins committed while punishing people in groups he once punished. So God, proof positive of this, God sent the Babylonians to punish the Israelites. He still punished the Babylonians for all of their crimes. Because, yes, the destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonians was not a crime because God wanted them to do that. That was something they were supposed to do. What they weren't supposed to do was take all of his instruments of worship and then use them to throw wild, drunken parties. What they weren't supposed to do is inflict their people and the Jewish people with a bunch of afflictions and oppression. What they weren't supposed to do was mistreat all of the blessings God had given them. What they weren't supposed to do was worship false gods. So, just because one thing is something God wanted does not mean everything that that nation does is something God wants. And God will come and cause a reckoning for the things that, for the crimes of different people. Carrying out God's wrath is not in and of itself a sin, in fact, far from it, but it also is not a do anything you want card. So there's much debate as to the specific events being talked about in these two chapters. Because some preterists will say, well, this applies to here, and some preterists will say this applies to this. But what we need to know is some of them say it applies to the destruction of Jerusalem. Some of them say it applies to the destruction of Rome. For the futurists, once again, everything is literal. So after a mountain-sized meteor falls on the planet, after everyone's been destroyed in nuclear war, after all of this stuff that apparently only affected a third of the earth happens, despite the fact that we're talking about stuff so catastrophic, the world would be splitting in half. After all of that, everyone who is still alive is covered in boils. The sea turns into congealed blood. The rivers and springs turn into regular blood. The sun literally starts scorching people with fire. Wait, that's just insane. And I don't care if we've made it through a meteor that's the size of a mountain. We're not making it through that. No, if the sun starts sending fire on people, the atmosphere has caught on fire and we're all dead. Somehow people make it through that, and then everything is plunged into darkness, so the sun is turned off. The great river Euphrates dries up, and all of the demonic forces and everyone else gathers for a final battle at a mountain that's also a valley. And then finally, this entire army is swallowed by an earthquake. And that's it. But for the idealists, the final judgments are in a people who've rejected God and his people. The end result is almost as if they've never existed. Their culture is replaced, their own laws damage them, and the little things that they took for granted is gone and done away with. Their lying prophets are removed, and God is shown to be God and not mocked for long. So if we're applying this to Rome, if you go to Rome today, do you expect it to have the Roman culture of the past, or do you expect it to have Italian culture of today? And how different are those? Right. It's almost as if the Romans of the past never existed. Yes, their descendants are still around. They have a wildly different culture. In fact, they're unrecognizable. Right? The people who live in Italy today are nothing like the people who lived in Italy 2,000 years ago. They don't even have the same language. Right? The Romans of 2,000 years ago spoke Latin. They speak Italian today. Its mother language is Latin. It shares a lot of the root words. It's a very different language. It's almost as if the Romans of 2,000 years ago never existed. Their culture has been so wildly changed. Whereas the people who lived, so for instance, the Germans have actually technically never had an empire, not like this. The Germans who live in Germany today, culturally, well, today they're culturally much different. But the Germans who lived in Germany even 300 years ago were not that culturally different from the Germans who lived in Germany about the time of the Roman Empire. They just weren't. And most of the cultural changes in Germany nowadays has been because of technology advancement. It hasn't, and then also because of they lost the war, World War II and World War I. But I think that's fascinating that the Italians, they've been wildly different from the Romans ever since the fall of the Roman Empire. But the Germans have only been wildly different from their ancestors in the past 300 years. And it wasn't because they really lost any war, it was because of technological advancement mostly. That changed them from a culture of mercenaries into a, well, not really warmongers anymore. But, yeah. Anyway, that took me a little bit longer to get over everything than I meant it to. But we'll go ahead and say a prayer, and the lesson's yours. Lord, thank you for allowing us the opportunity to study this book, to ponder its message, and to apply it to our lives. Help us to always remember whom all blessings come from, and to never take anything for granted. In Jesus' name, amen.